Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Chapter 9, applying the understandings that we've gained in 5, 6, 7, and 8, now looking at international trade. These are the questions we're going to look to address in this presentation. What determines how much of a good a country will import or export? Next, who benefits from trade? Who does trade harm? And do the gains outweigh the losses? And then finally, if policymakers make a decision to restrict the amount of material coming into the country, imports, who benefits? Who is harmed? And do the gains from restricting imports outweigh the losses? Our introduction. Remember from Chapter 3, we talked about international trade. And we said a country has a comparative advantage in a good if it produces that good at a lower opportunity cost than other countries. So if we're producing two goods per se, maybe it's cars and fish. And when I produce cars, I give up fewer units of fish than you do. We would say I have a comparative advantage in it. It's I give up less of the other good. I'm missing out on less when I produce that good. Then I would have a comparative advantage. Countries gain from trade if each exports the goods where they have a comparative advantage. And what we're going to do is really put this all together. 5, 6, 7, and 8, we were talking about overall welfare for society. Now we're going to look to combine what we learned in Chapter 3, talking about international trade, with our new understandings of welfare and see who gains, who loses, and whether international trade is really good using our new vocabulary. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to have an analysis. You're going to see a supply and demand graph, and one of the things you're going to find on this supply and demand graph is PW. P subscript W is going to be a reference to the world price of a good. It is the price that's going to prevail in world markets. It is communicating to you that outside your country, that is the price that you can buy or sell that good at. It is going to be a flat price. It is not determined by quantity. We are going to say that we can buy an infinite quantity at that world price. So it's going to be a simplified version of reality, but for our purposes, it's going to be highly beneficial. We're also going to say we have P subscript D, or the domestic price without trade. When supply, domestic supply, meets domestic demand, we're going to have a price that will be determined in that country without trade, a domestic price. Now, if our domestic price, the price that is determined by domestic supply and demand, if it is less than the world price, what we're going to find is that country has a comparative advantage in it. They face a lower cost than the rest of the world. And because they have a comparative advantage, we would say if the domestic price is less than the world price, that country should export that product when given the opportunity to, if the world is open to free trade. Now, if the reverse is the case, if the domestic price determined by domestic supply and demand exceeds the world price, that country does not have a comparative advantage in the production of that good or service. And under free trade, that country is going to import the good. So make a little bit more sense when we show it on a graph. Our product is soybeans. We have upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. These represent the domestic supply and demand for soybeans. Where domestic supply meets domestic demand, we have our equilibrium price and quantity. 500 units bought and sold, each at a price of $4. PD is 4. Now, in this example, we're just giving a hypothetical that the world can do it at $6. So we can buy an infinite quantity, or the world will buy an infinite quantity of soybeans at $6. That's what we're saying with PW. Remember now what we just looked at in the previous slide. If the price determined in the domestic market is less than the world price, what would we say this country has? We would say this country has a comparative advantage in the production of soybeans, and therefore should look to export this product. And that's what they're going to do, because the world does this at a higher cost. They would benefit, the world would, from importing products from this country, whether it's the United States or any other country. Now what we're going to see is we have different outcomes. what we're going to say is that every single unit of soybeans is going to be sold at this world price, regardless of who's buying it. Whether it's a domestic consumer or a foreign consumer, everyone buys at this $6 price. Because when we open up to foreign trade, domestic consumers are actually competing for soybeans with foreign consumers. Anybody who wants soybeans has got to pay for it. And if the world is willing to pay $6 and buy a hypothetical infinite quantity, then those domestic consumers, even though without trade they could buy at 4, are now going to have to pay the higher price of 6. So the question is, how many domestic consumers are still buying soybeans? It's only going to be those that value soybeans the highest. This section of the domestic demand curve represents those who value soybeans the highest. From 0 to 300 units, somebody, let's say this is the United States, values that product more than $6. So if the world price is 6, and that's the price that is being charged to everyone, this is going to represent domestic consumption, 300 units of soybeans. However, what we're going to find sold by domestic producers is going to be 750 units. And you might now be confused. How are domestic producers selling 750 units when domestic consumers are only buying 300? Well, what we said was we're opening up our country to trade. We do it better than other countries. So what's going to happen now is our country, our domestic producers, will be exporting products. And it will be the difference between these two. There will be 450 units that are exported from, let's say, the United States, because in the United States, our cost is lower than the world. Now, what we want to do is combine our understandings that we just gained in chapters 7 and 8. And take a look at what's happening now that there is some kind of different market outcome. We're not taxing or introducing a price floor, but we're going to get a different outcome because we're opening up our country to trade. What happens to consumer, producer, and total surplus? Well, these letters are going to represent spaces. A is this triangle. B is this trapezoid. Okay? D is this triangle. And C is this triangle. What we want to do is take a look at whether we benefit or whether we lose when we engage in free trade. So, without trade, consumer surplus is areas A and B. I'm going to erase here real quick. So, without trade, the price is $4 and we're buying whatever amount this is. The area above the price and below the demand curve is consumer surplus, therefore it's A and B. Producer surplus is area C, the area below the price but above the domestic supply curve. So areas A, B, and C are going to be our total surplus. Producer plus consumer. But when we trade, we get different outcomes. When we trade, consumer surplus shrinks to A because consumers in our domestic market now have to compete with foreign consumers. A higher price is charged to everyone. So A is now the area above the price but below the demand curve. That's our remaining consumer surplus. You might then be inclined to say, we don't like trade because it hurts consumers in this instance. But, bear with me, take a look at what happened to producer surplus. Domestic producers are now getting C, B, and D. B, they capture from domestic consumers. That used to be excess surplus for them, but now it goes and is captured by producers. What we've gained, though, is D. We're selling more units, not to Americans, but to foreigners. And there is additional surplus that we gain from that. Therefore, if we're not being biased, if we're saying we don't care producer or consumer, we care about the totality of it, we would say total surplus has actually grown to the tune of section D, that triangle. So, while consumers lost, producers' gains exceeded their losses. Now, let's take a look at a different market. Okay, sorry, I'm having trouble with the smart board. Let's look at the market for plasma TVs. $3,000 is our domestic price. $1,500 is our world price. For whatever reason, the world can do it better than we can. What's going to happen in this instance? Will we export or import this product? Hopefully we understand that if the world is doing it at a cheaper price, we're going to import a lot of these products. In the world markets, it's $1,500. Okay, under free trade, how many TVs will the country export or import? I just answered that question. We are going to be importing, but we need to figure out how many. Okay? And what we need to then do is take a look at consumer, producer, and total surplus without trade and with trade. That's the exercise that we're going to complete. Hopefully we can say that consumer surplus, when we do not trade, is going to be the area represented by that triangle. It is the area above the price and below the demand curve. Hopefully we can say that the area above the supply curve and below the price is our producer surplus when we engage in no trade whatsoever. That is our then total surplus. What happens now when we engage in international trade? Excuse me, sorry about this. What we're going to find is that only those who produce plasma TVs domestically at the very best price are going to still produce. This section of the curve right here represents those producers who can produce in the United States the best at the lowest cost. Everyone in the world, the world can provide it at $1,500, but these people domestically can produce even at a lower cost. When we open up the world to trade, every plasma TV is going to sell for $1,500. And the only domestic producers who are going to be surviving and selling are those who can do it for even cheaper. So 0 to 200, that's how many units are going to be sold by our domestic producers. I'm going to put that as QD. However, when it's $1,500, take a look at how many units our domestic consumers would want to purchase. Domestic consumption will go all the way over here to 600 because that's where our tastes and preferences meet the world price. So Q, I'm going to put it, put it as QC, or yeah, QC is fine. That's going to be how many units are bought and sold in total. But then you may be confused. If domestic producers are only producing 200, yet our consumers are consuming 600, how can that be? Hopefully we understand that everything in here is going to be imported. So all of that will be imports. Then we need to say, was that beneficial or harmful to our society? And that's where we need to fill in that, or utilize the language that we learn in Chapter 7 talking about overall economic well-being or welfare. We would now say, okay, what is our consumer surplus? Our consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. We used to be paying $3,000 for every unit. Now we pay $1,500. This entire triangle is our consumer surplus. And while producers who are domestic have been harmed, they now get a lower price and they sell fewer units. Take a look at what has happened to our total surplus. Our total surplus is consumer plus producer. This triangle right here has been added to. We have gained that triangle. So while we say domestic producers lost when we opened up the country to imports, consumers gained more than the producers lost. So here we have all of the information to just confirm my conclusions. A, B, D, and C. We had before A, B, and C. That was our total surplus. Without trade, consumer surplus is A, producer surplus was B and C. Total surplus was A, B, and C. But with trade, consumer surplus A, B, and D. Producer surplus is C. Total surplus A, B, C, and D. D was our gain. Importing, in this situation, is beneficial when we look at things in the totality. Okay? So, the summary slide here, we're not quite done, but this is just a brief summary. When we have the domestic price less than the world price, we're going to export because we do it at a lower cost. Consumers are going to be hurt domestically, yes, but producers are going to gain, and their gains will exceed those of the losses for consumers. Over here, with the domestic price exceeding the world price, we're going to import. Consumers, their surplus is going to rise. Producer surplus, domestic producers, theirs is going to fall, and total surplus will rise. Okay? So whether a good is imported or exported, trade creates winners and losers, but the gains exceed the losses, and that's what we're focusing on. That we are gaining more than we are losing. International trade is beneficial. Other benefits of international trade. So consumers are going to enjoy a variety of goods. We think there's value in variety. Producers sell to a larger market, and they may achieve lower costs by producing on a larger scale. We'll talk about economies of scale in future chapters. It'll make more sense why when you sell more, you actually see reduced costs, and thus opening ourselves up to international trade may indeed be beneficial above and beyond what we just showed you. Competition from abroad may reduce market power of domestic firms. We're going to talk about this term in future chapters, market power, and how it actually creates distorted market outcomes, things that we'd say we could actually improve upon. So if we reduce the market power of domestic firms, that actually is going to increase total welfare. We'll learn more about that in future chapters. And it says trade enhances the flow of ideas, facilitates the spread of technology around the world. Obviously, when we open ourselves up to the world and the world opens itself up to us, you find us contributing new ideas and then incorporating new ideas. We facilitate the spread of technology. All those things are fringe benefits that come from international trade. So it says, why then all the opposition to trade? Recall from chapter 1 that trade can make everyone better off. So why is it there's so much opposition? The winners from trade could compensate the losers and still be better off. What we're saying is there's a lot of grumbling that comes from those who lose. And there are losers when we open ourselves up to trade. But one of the things that we could do, and I know this may be difficult, but the winners from trade, consumers when we import, producers when we export, could actually compensate those who are the losers, and we could come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. However, with international trade and the number of parties that would be involved, it would be very difficult in the real world to manage in a way to actually make that happen. Yet, such compensation rarely occurs. The losses, and this is why, the losses are often highly concentrated among a small group of people who feel them acutely. This is the reason why you hear about international trade perhaps being a bad thing, is the losses are to a small number of individuals. And when you have that small number of individuals who feel them acutely, meaning there is real harm done to that small group, they can organize and they can speak with one voice, and often they speak loudly. That's the reason why you hear so much grumbling about international trade. And the reason you don't find people defending international trade is it's hard to actually see the gains that are spread so thinly over so many people. It's hard for them to come together and really capture all of the gain that's had by everyone. So it's very difficult. What you hear from the media perhaps in this discourse among adults, it's often vilified, international trade is, and not glorified like it perhaps should be. So hence the losers have more incentive to organize and lobby for restrictions on trade. That's why we sometimes get it. Now, one of the ways that lobby manifests itself, when people organize and are looking to restrict international trade, one of the things that we find they implement is a tariff. So now we're going to incorporate an understanding from chapter 8. What happens when we tax a good or service? What happens when we tax a good coming in from outside the United States? So an example, we have cotton shirts. We have world price of 20. The tariff, because we believe maybe domestic producers of cotton shirts are harmed, we're going to put a $10 per shirt tax or tariff on this product. Consumers are therefore going to have to pay $30 for any shirt they import. This is going to make sense when I show you it on the graph. So domestic producers can now charge $30 as opposed to some lower price. So in general, the price facing domestic buyers and sellers equals PW plus T. This will make more sense when I show you on the graph. So here's our market for cotton shirts. This is our domestic price. Sorry, I'm going to put it up here. I'm going to put it as P star and Q star. That would be the price that is determined in the domestic market if we did not engage in trade. However, the world just simply does it better than in the United States at a $20 price tag for cotton shirts. So what we find is when we engage in free trade, 25 units are going to be produced by Americans. However, 80 units are going to be consumed by Americans. The 55 are going to be imported from outside the United States because they simply do it better. So many people might complain about this. We need to support those who are producing cotton t-shirts in the United States. How could you do so? You impose a tariff. So what we do is we increase the price by $10. Effectively, this is our supply curve because the world can provide, hypothetically speaking, an infinite number of t-shirts all at $20. So we just take from that and translate up by the size of the tax. In this instance, it was $10. So now this is PW, and this is PW with the tax. Question is, how does this affect all our parties here and then our overall economic well-being? Let's take a look. Well, when we have this higher price, because now the world cannot do it for $20. They can still make the t-shirt for $20, but they can't sell it to somebody in the United States for anything less than $30. What we find now is we've driven some American consumers out. We no longer have 80 units transacted. We only have 70 that's going to be bought and sold by Americans. Or excuse me, bought by Americans. And furthermore, we have some American producers who are now able to produce at a price that is less than the world price. Before, these were the only American producers who were producing. But now, okay, it's that entire area. We have 40 units. That's going to be our domestic production. Okay, this is our domestic consumption. And then obviously the difference is made up by the imports. But notice what happened to the imports. They shrunk from 55 to 30. Domestic production increased from 25 to 40. So the intent here was to help out domestic producers, and we did. But the question is, did we harm our society, our overall economic well-being? What happened to it? It'll be helped out by looking again with these letters. So when we look at the letters, free trade. What happens with free trade? Consumer surpluses, A, B, C, D, E, and F. It is the area above the price, but below the demand curve. Our producer surplus, the area above the supply curve and below the price, is G. That's all our total surplus. Now, when we impose this tariff, look at what happens. Consumers are now harmed. They lose out on C, D, E, and F. But that doesn't necessarily make it bad. We have to take a look at what producers gain. Producers are now having C and G. This is what our domestic producers gain. They gain all that surplus. So we did indeed help them. Additionally now, we have revenue that's going to the government. They're taxing to the tune of 10. And remember, they're only taxing imports. So this right here, that's all our imports. So we're only taxing imports. That's the reason why this box represents our government's tax revenue from the tariff. What then became of D and E, those that are shaded in yellow? because A, B, C, E, and G is our total surplus now. We've lost out on D and F. You know that that's dead weight loss. Those are mutually beneficial transactions that aren't happening. And let's further specify what those are. D and E, that's dead weight loss, but it's more specific. So D right here is dead weight loss from the overproduction of t-shirts. I need to modify this. It's the overproduction of domestic t-shirts. Goods 25 to 40 are produced now with the tariff by Americans. But it should be by the world. The world can do it better at a cost of $20. In this section, this represents Americans' costs. Americans aren't the best producers, yet they are producing. So this right here is because of the overproduction of domestic shirts. And over here now we have 10 units that are no longer sold or no longer bought by Americans. That was satisfaction that consumers would have. That is not realized anymore. So D and F are our dead weight loss. We do not, as a society, gain from the imposition of a tariff. Okay? Almost done with our presentation. This is virtually the end. If we don't impose a tariff, the other thing we can do is put a quota on. A quota is a quantitative limit on the imports into our country. So maybe we say, we only are going to import 100 units, or 5,000 units, or 5 million units, whatever it is. We're just setting a quantity restriction. We don't have a graph here, but it is mostly going to have the same effect as a tariff. It's going to raise the price, reduce the quantity, just like a tariff did. It is going to reduce buyers' welfare, and it is going to increase sellers' welfare. That's why they impose these things. Only 50,000 Japanese cars can come into the United States. That would be an import quota. The reason they would do that is to increase sellers' welfare. But just like a tariff, okay, I'll get to this in a second. The idea here is that the gains to the sellers will be exceeded by the harm done to our buyers, and therefore a quota, just like a tariff, is going to produce dead weight loss. Now, it says a tariff creates revenue for the government. So that was one of the benefits for our government, that they were getting revenue that they could spend on education and other things. But a quota creates profits for foreign producers. So if our goal was to help domestic producers and create some revenue, we would choose not a quota, but rather a tariff. Okay? And it says, or the government could auction licenses to imports to capture this profit as revenue. So, if they wanted to go the route of a quota, what they could do is they could sell those licenses. So if you want to import, you got to have a license. So I sell the license, and now you get an opportunity to import. I'd be raising revenue in that manner. It would look almost identical to the tariff. So, ladies and gentlemen, here are our summary slides. Our presentation is finished. Take a look. You can freeze it. Sorry. And our last slide. Ladies and gentlemen, Chapter 9 is finished. I hope you enjoyed. Please go fill out the response form.